Eh bien bonjour toutes et à toutes, c'était Jimmy Geffer, je vous retrouve pour une nouvelle vidéo, on se retrouve sur World of Tanks, j'espère que vous avez passé de bonnes vacances, moi ça a été. Et je rentre, j'allume la console mise à jour et là je vois mode histoire de World of Tanks, bon, on va voir qu'est-ce que ça va donner. Alors commencer l'histoire, je sais pas du tout qu'est-ce que ça va être. J'imagine que c'est le chargement.
Not every American tank built was destined for the U.S. Army. Some were transported through the Persian corridor into Russia. From the steelworks of Detroit, straight to the Eastern Front. And it wasn't just tanks that wound up in Russia. The Americans sent experienced combatants, too. Colonel Peters had joined the Russian advance into Romania. With the news spreading that a second front had opened up in France, both sides knew this was a critical turning point in the war. From his position on the hill, Peters and his Russian crew were about to get their first taste of action as a joint force.
Ok, bon c'est parti, ah, ok c'est un entraînement, ok j'en aurais pu le zapper.
The Germans had launched a preemptive strike on the Russian armor.
Ennemi sait où on est. Pénétration du blindage. Réservoir d'essence ennemi touché. On l'a eu.
Ok. Bon, on va zapper ça, hein. On va se prendre. On sera la vraie mode d'histoire. On se revoit.
The German preemptive strike had been fierce, the Soviet losses heavy. Regardless, the orders still stood. The Russian offensive would continue as planned. Colonel Peters suddenly found himself caught up with the push towards the enemy front line. The Russian Shermans had managed to stem the German onslaught, but they lacked the necessary reinforcements to press home their advantage. One thing was clear to Peters: they needed more tanks. It was now a race against time for the Russians. They could make for the disabled tank and turn it against their enemy, or engage the German patrol directly with the remaining Shermans. Peters prayed they would make the right call. Peters rallied his crew. It was their turn to strike back at the Germans. The advantage had swung from the Germans back to the Soviets. The preemptive strike had been curtailed. Peters, bolstered with captured enemy tanks, rejoined the main Russian force for the final assault. as they bore down on the German position, Peters was comforted by the thought that, if he fell, he would die surrounded by men he'd be proud to call brothers. The battle had been intense and lasted several hours. The Germans had fought with dogged tenacity, determined to halt the Soviet advance. But the might of the Russian armor proved too strong. The German defenses had crumbled as the Shermans punched a hole right through them. Now, nothing could stop Russia from knocking the Romanians out of the Axis. This day, this victory, belonged to Peters and his crew. With the news of his departure still ringing in his ears, Peters found himself surrounded by his fellow crew members. Their shared ordeal had bonded them together. Now, these fresh orders were wrenching them apart. Peters may have missed out fighting alongside his men in Normandy, but here, on the Eastern Front, he had found new brothers in armor he could stand shoulder to shoulder with. It never pays to make assumptions, especially when the Russians are involved. British command had mobilized their heavy armor and were advancing east into Soviet-occupied Germany. The Russians had a stranglehold on Berlin and were slowly choking the life out of it. The British objective was to establish a supply route to the encircled city. The airlifts had been abandoned after Tempelhof and Gatow airports were bombed by saboteurs. Captain Thompson from the 7th Armored Division, Desert Rats, was given the unenviable task of clearing the way into Berlin. Thompson wouldn't admit it to his men, but he knew he was about to prod a sleeping bear with a rather large 42-ton stick. Neither Thompson nor his men could quite believe what had just happened. Although it was only a bloodied nose, lives had been lost on both sides. There was a sudden shift in mood inside the Centurion, as if the consequences of their firefight had been played out between them. Thompson knew this was the start of something much, much bigger. Thompson had to keep his men focused on the job at hand. He knew the next enemy armor they'd meet wouldn't be caught napping. The Soviets had dug in, blockading the roads that led into Berlin. The only option left for Thompson was through town. Berlin. Nearly half of Captain Thompson's force were burning wrecks scattered across the East German countryside, a stark reminder of the men who had laid down their lives. Yet it wasn't the time to dwell on the dead. Their sacrifice meant the Allies had advanced within touching distance of their goal. Countless souls now depended on them crossing over the line. The shadow of a Third World War was drawing ever closer. Air support was gone, curtailed by the worsening weather conditions. The only thing Thompson and his remaining tanks had left was the strength of their resolve. Somewhere beyond this hellish fury, the cream of the Russian army, the 9th Tank Division, lay in wait. Thompson would meet the enemy head-on and show them the true meaning of British grit. Thompson stared at the ring of Soviet steel that encircled the city. There was no escaping it. He would have to go through those tanks. Thompson's men had broken through the blockade around Berlin. The path was now cleared for Allied supplies to reach the starving population. Thompson had lost so many tanks to the Russians. The fighting had been fierce. The price had been high, paid by the blood of his men. For some families back home, this would be the first Christmas without a father, a brother, or son. From the ashes of grief, hope would spring once more. Berlin could breathe again. The grip of Soviet rule had been loosened. For now, the threat of another conflict lay unrealized. Politicians on both sides had been hesitant to escalate the situation any further. The world just wasn't ready for another global war. Yet, this was a defining moment in history, one which would see both sides staring across at one another with deep resentment and suspicion. It also heralded the birth of the UN and ensured a nervous peace held across Central and Eastern Europe. As for Thompson, his name would become as synonymous with the desert rats as Montgomery's own. The captain's selfless actions and that of his men ensured the citizens of Berlin had more reason than most to be thankful one cold Christmas Eve in 1948. With the RAF and the Royal Navy pinned down, Germany had successfully established a foothold in the last remaining resistance in Western Europe, Great Britain. Now, London was under siege and facing its darkest hour. Hitler was banking on the city being bombed into submission, breaking the British resolve once and for all. Dunkirk had taught the British one important lesson: never to give up in the face of the impossible. Failure to hold London would mean Britain and the war would be lost to the Germans. Lieutenant Edwards of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, 1st Army Tank Brigade, had been assigned to stem the tide of advancing German armor. With the Soviet Union bound to a non-aggression pact with the Germans, and America wallowing in isolationism, Edwards was left in no doubt that the British would face this storm alone. Hitler's assault on London had failed. What's more, the British rearguard had managed to push the German armor back into the surrounding countryside. The tables had been turned on the Third Reich. Lieutenant Edwards had been ordered to move his unit into German-held territory and recapture the RAF airfields, which were now being used by the Luftwaffe. As the British armor rolled across the bridge, Edwards knew this was their chance to pay back the Germans for Dunkirk, London, and the invasion of Great Britain. While the Germans continued to operate airfields on English soil, the RAF jockeys would never gain air superiority. The Germans had been pushed back to the landing beaches. Hitler's forces were now fighting a bitter defensive retreat. Sanctuary lay but a short distance from shore, where the Kriegsmarine were waiting. The British were in the ascendancy, but could not risk letting their quarry escape to regroup another day. For Lieutenant Edwards, this would be his greatest hour, the moment that he chased the Germans into the sea. Steel and blood. Edwards knew deep down that this would be a fight with no quarter asked and none given. They still had to overcome their biggest challenge yet. Beil of the 6th Panzer Division, one of Hitler's greatest commanders, was all that stood between success and failure. If Britain was to prevail, Edwards would have to defeat this commander. This was it. The day of reckoning had arrived. Edwards would pay the Germans back for the humiliation and suffering the British had endured at Dunkirk. Word spread. The British victory had been absolute. Hitler's war machine had been disassembled and scattered across the sands of this unassuming corner of England. Edwards and his crew watched as the long line of German prisoners were slowly escorted away from their defeat. Lieutenant Edwards was right. Preparations were already underway for a joint British and American force to invade northern France. Edwards and his Cromwells would soon be called upon once more to fight for a free Europe. It had been over a year since the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Now Khrushchev was within striking distance of landing a nuclear touchdown on American soil. President Kennedy wasn't prepared to let that happen. The United States was going to war. Sergeant Reese was part of an armored spearhead, which was going to sneak up on the Soviet forces stationed outside the U.S. base at Guantanamo. This wouldn't be a conventional invasion. The element of surprise would be the key to a swift victory. Deep in the belly of the transport ships headed towards Cuba, the American war machine prepared itself for battle. But even the best laid plans can go awry. Reese needed to keep his crew focused on the task ahead. With the Soviets now alert to their presence, every inch would be hard fought. The Major's orders were clear. Reese had to fight out of the landing area and locate the scattered American armor. The American excursion had been hampered by severe weather. Hurricane Ella, which military intelligence had assured would miss the area, was now relentlessly battering the region into submission. There was nothing Sergeant Reese or his men could do but wait it out. Gritted his teeth. With the storm reducing visibility, he knew he wouldn't be able to spot the enemy until he was practically nose to nose with them. Reese watched as the storm took hold. His gut told him that the untimely arrival of Hurricane Ella was a perfect opportunity for the enemy to launch an ambush. He hoped his instincts were wrong. The ire of Hurricane Ella had subsided, replaced by the fury of American steel, now headed towards their enemy. Time was running out. The Soviets were making preparations for a missile strike on the U.S. East Coast. Reese wasn't about to let that happen on his watch. With the skies clear, U-2 spy planes had pinpointed the location of 3 enemy launch sites. Everything now hinged on Reese and his unit blitzing the Soviet defenses to reach them. Reese patted the metal armor of his Walker Bulldog and ordered his unit forward. This was it, the moment of truth. They had to stop those missiles, come hell or high water. Reese had to face facts. There were just too many spots ahead for an enemy ambush. for Cuba was over. Against the odds, Sergeant Reese's unit had managed to halt the Soviet missile launch before it was too late. This was a bittersweet victory. Many of Reese's men would never see the hero's welcome waiting for them back home. The Soviet crisis had been dealt with, for now. Reese would never realize how close they came to World War III that day, nor the part he played in ensuring the uneasy peace between the United States and the Soviets remained in check.